afternoon. I'd like to welcome everyone to the Beef on Dairy Dialogue webinar series, an extension of the annual Dairy Beef Short Course that is held in conjunction with the Central Plains Dairy Expo each March. The short course is the longest running program focusing on steers with dairy genetics in the United States, with 15 years of continuous programming, and is sponsored by the I-29 Moo University, a consortium of extension specialists from Iowa State University, University of Minnesota, University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and South Dakota State University. I ask listeners to enter their questions in the chat box at the bottom of their screen, and Dr. Smirchek will answer them at the conclusion of his presentation. I have put the link for the program evaluation in the chat box and ask you to take a minute and give us your input to help us improve this series. The I-29 Moo University Beef on Dairy Dialogue series continues today, featuring Dr. Dathan Smirchek discussing the effects of growth-enhancing technology on mineral requirement in beef cattle. In the United States, the beef cattle industry continues to increase total beef production with a shrinking mature cow herd. From 1977 to 2007, a 44% increase in beef cattle growth rates. I'd remind everybody to mute their mics.
No. They leave it here all the time. I think they leave it out. Let's just go eat.
Okay, there we go. The 44% increase in beef cattle growth rates occurred, and this trend continues today. These improvements in growth and production are achieved through improved cattle genetics, precision nutrition strategies, increased days on feed, plus improved use or increased use of growth-enhancing technology. These technologies, such as steroidal implants and beta-adrenergic antagonists, are valuable tools that significantly improve growth performance and feed efficiency. Given that many trace mineral requirements were established over 40 years ago, it's important to reevaluate whether these standards still meet the needs of the modern beef animal. Dr. Smirchek is an assistant professor in animal science at Iowa State University with an appointment that primarily focuses on research. As I always say, Doc, the podium is yours.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I apologize for the lengthy write-up that I gave you there, but it does introduce some relevant topics for what we'll talk about today. So again, today we're going to be talking about the effects of growth-enhancing technologies on the mineral requirements in beef cattle. And so a lot of this research was originally done in straight-bred beef cattle or native beef cattle, but I do try to apply some context here with regards to beef on dairy cattle per the relevance to this particular webinar series and the talk that I gave in person this past spring. As a general outline, what we're going to talk about today is a general introduction, and then we're going to talk about how do growth-enhancing technologies, both implants and beta-agonists, affect the trace mineral requirements and growth performance of feedlot cattle. And specifically, we're going to focus in on zinc and copper. We're going to discuss the research, some of the research in these areas that inform what ultimately become our recommendations for each of these trace minerals that we think can impact growth performance in a meaningful way in the feedlot. And so then that gets into our practical application, our recommendations, feeding strategies, and then kind of an overall take-home message that summarizes this area of research that's been done over the past decade plus now here at Iowa State. And I was here for some of it towards the end, but Dr. Hansen really spearheaded majority of this work that we'll talk about today. So I think before we get into things, it's important to take a step back and think about where we're at now in the beef industry and what some of the trends are. I think everybody on this call realizes that there's been major advances in terms of beef cattle genetics in the past 40, 50, 60 years. substantial increases in the amount of growth enhancing technology used. The prevalence of those technologies continues to increase and be highly relevant. We're continuing to increase days on feed and body weight at harvest. Um, and then obviously precision cattle feeding continues to be something that is focused on and that improves year on year. And then relevant to today's topic, obviously that contribution to the beef supply from the beef on dairy population. And that can't be overlooked. And so this is something that I include in most of my talks, but we've increased the total amount of pounds of beef produced despite a shrinking cow herd. And a lot of the things that I listed above here are reasons why. And just for reference, from 1977 to 2007, which at this point is getting to be a little bit dated, we saw a 44% increase in beef cattle growth rates, right? So we're dealing with an animal that's bigger, grows faster, more efficiently than we were in 1977. So that's one of the key things that I think we have to understand and appreciate with regards to what we're going to talk about today. So next, let's talk about the growth enhancing technologies that are involved in these research trials that we'll talk about here shortly. And so steroidal implants and beta agonists are I'd say the two most prevalent growth enhancing technologies that come to mind when I think about feedlot production. Steroidal implants being number one, right? So that's probably the most prevalent growth enhancing technology used in the feedlot and is one of the most consistent technologies that allows a really substantial return on investment every time we use that. A significant improvement in growth rate, feed efficiency, and lean tissue mass of the carcass. Unless you're being paid a substantial premium to not use an implant, it's something that you almost have to use. Then with regards to beta agonists, ractopamine hydrochloride and levodopa fumarate or Experior, those are kind of the two primary ones used today. And again, technologies that are going to increase hot carcass weight, growth performance there at the end of the feeding period. And suffice it to say that together, steroidal implants and beta agonists work to increase protein synthesis and really muscle growth. And then to tie it into the topic of today, we know that trace minerals are essential in a lot of these processes that allow for protein synthesis and high degrees of muscle growth. And so that brings us into talking a little bit more about trace minerals. So I think this is something that in some cases can be overlooked because they're really small, quantitatively, they're a very small component of the diet, but they're extremely important. And so they're involved in an extremely long list of functions. They're essential for skeletal development, protein synthesis and muscle growth, general energy metabolism, immune response, antioxidant capacity, and much, much more. I mean, there's entire years of courses you can take just to understand some of these trace minerals and what they do in the body. But suffice it to say that proper trace mineral nutrition is essential for optimal performance. If you want to get the most out of your cattle, and as we'll try to discuss here, and I'll try to show you today, if you want to get the most out of your growth enhancing technologies, proper trace mineral nutrition is really, really important, especially when we're using those growth enhancing technologies. And so here's the next couple of slides to really try to add some context to the beef on dairy side of things with regards to liver copper. And so obviously the zinc stuff is definitely applicable to beef on dairy cattle, just like it is to the native beef cattle. But I think uniquely the copper challenge becomes something that I think is really relevant to beef on dairy cattle. So just to set things up, the ruminant liver is actually kind of unique in that Dr. Hansen, who I did my PhD with.
Ouais. Foi, mon livre, c'est pas
Sorry.
c'est pour te bien. Le tien, peut-être pas.
And so it really acts kind of like a sponge for copper, right? So as we increase dietary copper supplementation,
Tu m'appelles par
we're
rapport
going
à
to increase our liver copper concentration, and that kind of increases steadily. And in humans,
parce qu'en
pigs,
fait,
as you can see
ouais,
here,
c'est ça.
hens, we don't get an increase in liver copper until we really get that dietary copper rather high. Whereas with calves and sheep, we see there's just kind of a linear increase. As we increase dietary copper, we're going to increase liver copper. And so that's something that's important to consider because dairy influenced calves are at higher risk for copper toxicosis. Primarily because dairy operations commonly supplement copper well above NASEM recommendations, which increases the copper toxicosis risk. And we know that placental transfer of copper from that dam is substantial. And then when that animal is born, milk replacer contains copper in a lot of cases. and the starter diet in some cases contains a pretty high amount of copper. And so we've got these calves that are born with adequate liver copper, and then we feed them more in both their milk, the milk replacer, and starter diet, and we produce these calves that have liver copper, at 450 parts per million or greater, and this can be problematic. So, what you'll find out there is for a liver copper reference range of where you want to be, and the Kincaid 2000 reference, it's 125 to 600. So, first thing to point out here is that's a really wide range, right? It's an extremely wide range, and there is some data that would show that, before we hit that 600 period, we can actually run into some negative oxidative stress in the liver before we even get to what the Kincaid reference would say is too high. So these calves with 450 plus parts per million of liver copper could be experiencing some issues at the point of the liver, which could decrease performance. And we'll talk about some of that stuff later when we get to the copper portion of the talk. So then to kind of just take it back to the more general feedlot level, so what does typical trace mineral supplementation look like in the feedlot? So how are we managing cattle? So the Samuelson in 2016 survey of feedlot consulting nutritionists found that most nutritionists were supplementing greater than the NASEM requirement, right? And so when we look at copper and zinc specifically, they're feeding twice the copper requirement, so 20 parts per million rather than 10, and they're feeding about 100 parts per million zinc rather than 30, right? So again, this was Dr. Hansen. She was the one who was kind of on top of this, and I think the initial question was, well, is that effective? Or are they just throwing money out the window, or are they getting something from that additional trace mineral supplementation? And so that led to the Niedermeyer study in 2018, where they tested exactly that. So they took NASEM concentrations, just book values, 10 parts per million copper, 30 parts per million zinc, 20 parts per million manganese, and so on, and supplemented that to the diet of one of the treatments. And then they took the results from the survey, right, where they fed 20 parts per million copper, 100 parts per million zinc, and 50 parts per million manganese, and so on. And then they had a non-supplemented control. And then beyond that, they actually had implanted cattle and non-implanted cattle to see if there was a differential effect when we fed those different levels of trace minerals, and then depending on their growth enhancing technology status or implant status. And so what they saw in the non-implanted cattle, when they looked at the industry supplementation levels, so when they fed greater than NASEM recommendations compared to just simply unsupplemented cattle, about a 13 kilogram advantage in hot carcass weight. So feeding trace minerals generally was really advantageous. But when we implanted those cattle, that benefit became even larger. And so this was kind of the first synergistic effect that we saw with regards to the interaction between trace minerals and growth enhancing technologies. And this really led to a series of research trials that ultimately led to the grant that I actually ran the research for as part of my PhD. And so then that takes us to kind of the working model for this growth enhancing technology by trace mineral interaction. And I'll try to walk you guys through it step by step, kind of the way that I think this was approached initially. So cattle growth rates have increased substantially through genetics, nutrition. We're working with a bigger, faster growing, more efficient animal than we were 50 years ago. We know that implants and beta agonists support and provide a lot of this increased growth, and we know that they're used in a vast majority of typical production scenarios. So that's kind of a normal part of life in the feedlot, is working with implants and beta agonists, increasing that growth rate. All of the literature and all that we know about trace minerals show that they are essential in supporting these normal growth processes, and certainly, as we'll talk today, it appears they're very important for supporting that additional growth that we're asking of those animals with the implants and beta agonists. And as we'll discuss, we actually have found that implants appear to influence trace mineral homeostasis and possibly the trace mineral requirement. I'll talk about why that is, but we do see that when we give an implant, it changes the plasma zinc and plasma manganese of that animal, and typically those two metrics don't like to change in typical scenarios for that animal. So that shows us that there may be something changing with regards to that animal's requirement for that specific trace mineral. We just talked about the Niedermeyer study where they supplemented the NASEM recommendations, industry or non-supplemented, and we see that we improved growth performance in implanted cattle. And then that led to further work, which ultimately led to my PhD work, which tried to key in on those individual trace minerals, right? Because in this study, we weren't really able to tell which one of these trace minerals was having the biggest effect, which one was the biggest contributor to that improved growth performance. And based on the literature, the first place they went, Dr. Hansen's group, was working with zinc, because zinc is involved in a ton of things in the body related to growth. And so it was kind of the natural first option to look into as we tried to better understand this interaction between trace mineral nutrition and growth enhancing technology use. But there were certainly still some questions within this model, things that we didn't quite have all the answers to. First, and what I've kind of tried to allude to here, are all trace mineral requirements the same for this animal that continues to grow larger and faster? And do the current NASEM recommendations allow for optimal growth? And I think this is an important piece of the puzzle. One, because current trace mineral requirements were established in a lot of cases 40, 50 years ago. And a consideration to that being that a lot of those requirements were set to prevent deficiency, not necessarily to optimize growth, and certainly not in a 1,600-pound animal gaining 4+ pounds a day. Okay, and so then that's just kind of the list of where manganese, zinc, and copper are set in terms of NASEM requirement. And so our one of the research questions we had is there an optimal concentration of available zinc or other trace mineral of interest needed in the diet to support a given growth rate, particularly when we give an implant or feed a beta agonist? And then kind of the last question, and I think one of the key things to consider between the zinc work we'll discuss and the copper work we'll discuss, is more always better? Are those nutritionists that are feeding 2 to 3.5 times the NASEM concentration for certain trace minerals? Is that effective? Is it advantageous? And should we be doing that? So is more always better? So we'll start with the finishing phase research related to zinc and implants specifically, and then we'll get into some beta agonist stuff. So I'll try to use my pointer here. Hopefully everybody can see it. And I like to start with this slide when I talk about this work, because I think it's really kind of the foundation of why we've seen a lot of the results we've seen. Okay, so like I said, implant administration decreases plasma zinc and liver manganese consistently. We've seen this response, these two figures right here, very consistently across most all of the experiments that we've done. So the dotted line here is the implanted cattle. The black line, the solid line, is non-implanted for both of these. What you see in the first 20 days, that when we give an implant, we decrease plasma zinc, we decrease liver manganese, and we take that to mean that there's a difference in tissue need for those trace minerals when we give an implant. Or in this case, perhaps those animals are taking up more of that zinc into the tissue to be used for growth function. And it just so happens that that's the time of greatest hormone payout from that implant. And so this is one actually from my master's advisor's PhD work in 2018, where they looked at a bunch of different implant protocols. So there's a lot of extra lines on this graph, but I'm just focusing on this black line, solid black, where you can really see in that uncoated kind of standard implant that typically pays out over 100, 120 days, most of that hormone pays out in that first 20 to 35 days, which happens to be the same exact period of time when we see this decrease in plasma zinc and liver manganese. And so the greatest amount of growth demand is occurring during this period, the greatest amount of hormone payout, and then the changes to those plasma zinc and liver manganese measures indicating a difference in need for those trace minerals in the tissue. Okay, and so what did we end up seeing? So after we kind of got into the zinc end of things and we tried to really track down what was going on there was a few different studies all run by Elizabeth Messer-Smith, who's now at Foot Cattle in Kansas. She ran several trials looking at different zinc supplementation strategies along with implant, right? And so what we ended up seeing is that increased zinc supplementation improves growth performance and hot carcass weight in implanted cattle specifically. Okay, and so we really don't see this response in non-implanted cattle. And so what this bar graph shows is actually hot carcass weight advantage over controls. So controls being non-supplemented cattle. And so this zero baseline is basically what the hot carcass weight was for non-supplemented cattle. And then in this first study, they supplemented 30, 100, 150 parts per million of zinc, 100, 150, 180, and then 100. And so we can see in the first study, just supplementing zinc sulfate at these concentrations resulted in either 1 to 5 kilograms of extra hot carcass weight. In this study, which was a 98-day study, 100 to 180 resulted in a little bit more variable response, but somewhere between 5 to 9 kilograms, so a pretty large response here. And in the last one, right around 4 kilograms. And so here is what, at the time, I probably could update these, but this was the cost of that zinc sulfate for the entire feeding period at that feeding rate. So most of them not much more than $1 of investment in terms of trace mineral cost, and we get a pretty substantial improvement, albeit variable, in terms of hot carcass weight. So sizable improvements in economically relevant carcass traits with a comparatively small input cost. And so that's why we think this is really interesting. We're just by adding more zinc to the diet in these studies, we see we're able to get more out of that implant, which is already an investment that results in a pretty substantial ROI. But we can get even more out of it by optimizing our trace mineral nutrition. And so that leads me into my PhD work, which was in the spring of 2022. This is one of the trials that I did focusing on zinc. We don't have time today to talk about the manganese trial, and I thought that the zinc stuff was more interesting. The zinc and copper stuff together are more interesting than the manganese stuff. But this was kind of supposed to be the capstone project that kind of helped put the finishing touches on a lot of this zinc work that we've done. Where we, in this case, we fed zinc as zinc sulfate like we have in all of our previous trials that I've talked about so far. And we supplemented either at 0 parts per million, so a negative control. That diet analyzed at 53 parts per million of zinc. And so this was just there in the feed, whatever was in the feed stuff we were using. So reasonably high already. That's one thing that's, I think, important to note in this study. And then 30 and 100 parts per million. So NASEM and then that industry supplementation level. Analyzed at 83 parts per million and 157. So our treatments worked. We got the right amount of zinc in the diet. And then we had a non-implanted control and a high potency combination implant treatment. So half those cattle got a high potency combination implant factorialized with either 0, 30, or 100 parts per million of zinc. And so for the first 28 days, we sort of saw what we expected to see. Okay, so we saw, at least when we compare zinc supplemented cattle, so the zinc 30 and zinc 100 calves, to the non-supplemented, we see that, there's like a 0.2 kilogram improvement in average daily gain and a nice improvement in gain to feed that obviously fits with our average daily gain numbers. We didn't see a linear increase, whereas we increased zinc supplementation, we increased growth performance, and we'll talk about some of the nuances of why that maybe happened. But for the first 28 days, where implant payout's the greatest, lean tissue growth is the greatest, we did see that additional zinc was beneficial. But interestingly, when we look at the overall data, there's some numeric trends in here, right? Like 0.1 kilograms, slight difference in gain to feed, but non-significant. This was different than a lot of the previous work we'd done, right? We'd seen a lot of really large improvements in growth performance, and here it was a lot more muted. But we still see the numeric trends. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why we think that happened and why actually I was very frustrated at the time when I conducted this study because I expected these nice, beautiful linear results, and this would be the nice capstone to put the finishing touches on everything. But I think this study was actually very useful in terms of adding a lot of context to this body of work. And so to add on to that, increasing supplementation in this study alone did not improve hot carcass weight significantly. And so that was one of the other things that we had to try to consider and add to our overall conclusions when it comes to the zinc and implant story. So again, in my study, we did see that for the first 28 days when hormone payout is the highest and when growth performance is the greatest, zinc supplementation, either zinc 30 or zinc 100, was beneficial. But we didn't see an overall performance boost. So why? And why did these results differ from these nice hot carcass weight and growth responses that we've seen in a lot of Elizabeth Messersmith's previous work? So the first thing I think is the basal diet zinc, right? And on the first slide, I showed you guys that even the control animals had about 53 parts per million of zinc in their diet, which is getting close to twice the NASEM recommendation. So, we don't know how available that zinc is, if it's tied up, if it's available to them in the gastrointestinal tract. But regardless, that's a pretty high amount of zinc, much higher than a lot of these studies. And so the other thing that we had to consider was the growth potential of the cattle. And so in the later portion of this study, Average daily gain, feed efficiency really fell off more than it had in some of the previous trials where we had some really high growth rate cattle, some really high performers. So I think that's certainly part of it. And so in this case, it kind of looked like certainly in the beginning of the trial, 83 parts per million zinc or 30 was enough to cover the extra gain that we were asking of that animal with the implant. Um, and so let's change gears a little bit. I've got a handful of slides on beta agonists. Kind of in a similar line of work, we were trying to understand how zinc supplementation influences beta agonist response. And so what you can see here is this is a very similar chart to the implant response. We're looking at hot carcass weight advantage over controls and then different zinc supplementation rates. And I think one of the main things you can see here is that it's much more variable. And I think that fits. And all this was done with ractopamine. All this work was. So I think one of the first things to point out, much more variable response to zinc, but in some cases, very large response. And I don't know, we probably haven't really sussed out exactly why that's so variable. It could be a body composition thing. It could just be cattle type, could be time of year, but certainly more variable. But one I think is interesting to highlight, it was done by Olivia Genther in 2016, where they looked at the increasing supplementation of zinc amino acid complex on growth and carcass characteristics of cattle fed ractopamine hydrochloride. So a little bit smaller trial, 42 animals, 4 treatments for 86 days, and obviously at the end they were fed ractopamine. So the control diet was actually added. They actually had 60 parts per million of zinc from zinc sulfate in that diet, and so the total diet analyzed at 88. So the basal diet, if you subtract that, was 28. So if we compare that to the study I just talked about for my PhD work, where it was like 53 parts per million, obviously a lot lower basal concentration. So then the remaining treatments were this control diet plus 30 parts per million of zinc from that zinc amino acid complex, 60 parts per million or 90 additional parts per million on top of that control diet. And so then on day 88, half of those pens began on ractopamine, and then half remained not on ractopamine, so that you could see the differences in response to zinc as it pertains to ractopamine. And so what they ended up seeing is greater zinc supplementation. So as we increase that zinc amino acid complex from 30, 60 to 90, we actually kind of see this nice linear response in terms of average daily gain, final body weight, and feed efficiency, which I don't have on the slide. But as we increase zinc supplementation, we increase response to ractopamine growth performance. So I think that fits pretty nicely with some of the implant work that we've done. I don't think we have everything completely figured out, but just to kind of try to sort of summarize what we've seen to this point. In all of the studies that we've done, steroidal implants and beta agonist feeding appear to increase tissue zinc demand and alter the requirement that animal has for zinc based on a lot of our data. And I think our growth performance data, by and large, support this, where we see improvements in hot carcass weight, average daily gain, and body weight. And so what it comes down to is ultimately where do we think people need to be in terms of supplementing zinc to the diet? And I think in a lot of production scenarios, supplementing zinc at approximately 100 parts per million likely allows for the best response to implant and beta agonist. And so that's kind of where we have been suggesting people go with that. And then it kind of poses the research question of, do we need to revisit how we define requirements in modern beef feedlot production, where perhaps just avoiding deficiency isn't the primary goal, but trying to optimize production and performance is the primary goal. Okay. So we'll shift gears once again, and we'll talk briefly about copper. So copper is a lot different than zinc when we talk about research and how it is stored and functions in the body. But just like zinc, it's involved in a lot of key pathways that are important for growth, things of that nature. It's highly involved in the extracellular matrix, antioxidant capacity, iron mobilization, copper transport, amongst a lot of other things. But copper is very pro-oxidant. So when it's stored in high quantities or high concentrations in tissue, it can actually cause oxidative stress. And And this study shows that oxidative stress can actually start at as low as 400 parts per million of liver copper. And so that's why those beef on dairy calves that we mentioned early on are more at risk of being impacted negatively by high liver copper. And as I pointed out earlier, unlike zinc and manganese, which are needed in reasonably high quantities in daily feed intake and are managed, I should say that their concentration is managed more carefully by the body and that they can excrete it. Basically, you don't accumulate zinc endlessly in the liver like we do copper. So prolonged copper supplementation can really, really increase your liver copper. And then again, these are the current reference ranges. And so obviously, with Dr. Hansen's interest in copper nutrition and in kind of the interaction between trace minerals and growth enhancing technologies, a logical question was, does copper status impact ractopamine response? We were just kind of curious as that was one of the other main differences in how industry nutritionists supplement trace minerals to beef cattle. And so one of the nice things about being able to really change liver copper with dietary copper concentration, like we really can't with zinc, but we can actually use dietary copper to change the status of that animal meaningfully, so that we can actually create, in this case, a low, medium, and high status that we can use in a research setting to then test something like ractopamine response. And so that's exactly what they did. So in this experiment that we'll talk about, again, Elizabeth Messersmith, she's very busy as a PhD student. They created 3 distinct liver copper statuses based on those reference ranges. So low, medium, and medium being kind of adequate, where we'd like those animals to be, and then high, greater than 500, 600 parts per million, low being below that 125 mark. And the goal here was to maintain liver copper distinctions throughout the current trial. And so they did this with low, medium, and high by feeding them either 0, 10, or 20 parts per million of copper from a copper amino acid complex, which was a Zinpro product. And the objective was to determine if performance and growth characteristics, or carcass characteristics, of beef steers were differentially affected by these 3 distinct liver copper concentrations. And so what they ended up finding when we look at average daily gain was, I actually think, very interesting, and I think is really informative when we look at the entire presentation today, when we think about is more always better. So what they saw is that copper status actually impacts ractopamine response. Okay, and so the gray bars are deficient treatment. The yellow bars in the middle were considered adequate based on liver copper concentration. And then the red bars were adequate to high. So there is some overlap, but by and large, they were grouped by deficient, adequate, and then adequate to high. And then, these aren't showing up awesome, but the checkered boxes were fed ractopamine. So the right column was fed ractopamine. This one was not fed ractopamine. This one was not, and so on over here. So what we ended up seeing is actually in the adequate liver copper cattle, or adequate copper status, that they had a nice 23% improvement in average daily gain when they went on ractopamine. When they had adequate to high liver copper, that was blunted. They only saw about an 8.3% improvement in gain. And when they were deficient, they actually saw that there was a slight negative, or really no response to ractopamine at all. And so we were feeding this compound and we were getting nothing out of it because these animals were deficient. And likewise, if you have some animals in the feed yard that are, way on the high end or clinically toxic, they had a blunted response, so they weren't getting the most out of that technology. And so the last one that we'll talk about here quickly, and I'm actually moving along pretty quickly, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions. Copper status may affect exterior response. And this was a study done by Henderson and others. I actually think this may be published at this point, but I haven't updated that yet. What they ended up seeing here is again, they created these 2 different statuses in this case. So they had deficient cattle and then adequate cattle in terms of copper status. And then they either fed exterior or they didn't. And just like the previous trial we talked about. And so when we dig into dressing percentage and hot carcass weight a bit deeper, here we can see that the differences seem to be more due to the huge differences we see in the deficient treatment when we feed exterior, right? So right here. pretty big difference in these yellow bars, which represent the deficient cattle. And we actually don't see as much of an improvement in the adequate cattle. So a little bit different response than ractopamine, um, but still indicative of the fact that copper nutrition or copper status can change the way that cattle respond to a particular growth enhancing technology. And I also think that these data are kind of indicative that copper deficiency, just on its own, regardless of growth enhancing technology use, can be particularly bad for growth performance and growth outcomes in the feedlot. Okay, and so for a copper take-home message, so copper status clearly impacts beta agonist response. I think that's particularly clear with the ractopamine work that's been done here at Iowa State, where copper deficiency pretty much completely impaired the beta agonist response, and copper excess kind of resulted in a blunted response. I think that is a pretty clear piece of data that we've put together. And then copper deficiency generally, regardless of growth enhancing technology use, is not a good thing, right? And there's actually a bunch of other data that Dr. Hansen and Jacob have put together related to beef on dairy calf health and vaccine response that I recommend you guys go ahead and look up and find, because that's some pretty neat stuff related to copper nutrition as well. And so, unlike the zinc side of things, we would suggest that feedlot cattle really do not need greater than the NASEM recommendations for copper in their diets. Okay, so greater than 10 parts per million, we don't see any data that would suggest that that's beneficial. And in fact, as the data I've just presented would suggest, can actually be detrimental to performance. Okay, so for an overall take-home message, all trace minerals are not created equally. They've got distinct and different functions, different storage mechanisms, and as a result, different requirements. Based on all the research that we've done looking at how zinc nutrition interacts with implant response and beta agonist response, we'd suggest that you feed zinc in a lot of production scenarios at about 100 parts per million. And copper, keep that at the NRC or the NASEM recommendation to get the best response from, in this case, beta agonists. So the last bit I'd leave you with is more is not always better when it comes to trace mineral supplementation, and that there is certainly some nuance in how we need to manage those things. So with that, I'll take any questions, and that was actually a little bit quicker than I expected. So if there are some questions and clarification that's needed, please let me know. We can go back and discuss those things.
Very good. I would encourage everyone to just go ahead and unmute your mic and ask you a question. We're a small group and we'll be considerate of each other and not walk on each other.
So Dathan, I have a question on your zinc studies.
Yep.
Am I correct that some of the studies were zinc sulfate and some of them were an amino acid zinc complex? Would that make some of the difference of what you were seeing for results?
So for all of the implant work, the zinc by implant work, that was all zinc sulfate. The zinc by beta agonist work that Olivia Genther did, that would have been zinc amino acid complex. But by and large, all of the zinc by implant work was done with zinc sulfate. But I think to your point, I do think that that's part of the consideration. And that's probably the most consistent question that I get, and that I'm sure we all get related to this research is, maybe you could get away with 70 parts per million or 80 parts per million as an optimum concentration for if you're feeding fully organic or even a blend of organic and inorganic zinc. But I think that's an important piece of it. We haven't gone down that path yet to really figure out what the difference is in a research setting.
We've got another person unmuted. If you want to go ahead and ask your question. If not, go ahead.
I was going to say, still trying to come up with a question. Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I've got one here. From looking at your initial need, the first 28 days, would there be a benefit to supplementing feeders before they come into the feedlot?
Yes. Yeah. Quick answer is yes. I think that in a lot of cases, different reasons. And we didn't touch on that stuff today, and I tried to cover a lot of stuff, probably a little too quickly. But zinc is involved in a lot of different things. One of the main things it's involved in is immune function, right? And so certainly in feeders, lean tissue growth is occurring at that phase, but they also have probably an increased zinc demand from an immune standpoint as well. So I'd absolutely recommend feeding more zinc to feeders before they get in as well.
And at what rate would you recommend?
I'd I guess if it was mine, I'd probably just feed him at 100 parts per million. I think that would probably be close to hitting the requirement, but I don't know if we have a really hard answer on that. But I would say, um, depending on intake, more.
And I guess following up on that, you went over a lot of studies, which was great. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um, what were the environmental conditions and stocking rate or stressors placed on the cattle?
Mm-hmm. So in a lot of cases, I think most of these studies, kind of the way our cattle cycle works, is in the fall we'll run receiving trials or growing trials, and then in the winter into the spring we'll run the finishing trial. Oftentimes starting in late November, early December, and then sell those cattle in May, early June. So they do go through in the early portion of those studies, kind of a colder period, and then they get into the heat of the year. So I would say that those are probably some of the major stressors that they hit, just typical Iowa weather. They were in partially covered barns. I have to look at the square footage, what that is. They were 6 head pens, typically in a lot of cases in grow safe pens. Does that answer your question?
Kind of. I guess I'm more interested in your thoughts on what impact those stressors, however big or small they may be, may have had on those responses.
Mm-hmm. You're just thinking like in terms of what are environmental stressors that could also change the way that they respond to both implant maybe and zinc nutrition. Is that kind of what you're
Yeah,
asking?
just more so from an immune standpoint, to your point.
Mm.
I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just
No,
trying to
no. Yeah.
understand, is it the growth rate that affects it, or is it the fact that, at least from a dairy perspective, and I know this was beef on dairy, but we tend to overcrowd our cattle just a little.
Yeah, so I mean, I think yes, if there's additional health challenge, and that's probably one of the other nuances I didn't hit on well enough in this presentation, but there's no doubt that the benefit from the zinc is not just to muscle growth. It's not just to protein synthesis when we give an implant. Feeding more zinc is likely going to boost all of the different functions that animal has and requires zinc for. So to your point, I think, if we're overcrowding animals, if we're increasing potentially the disease load in a pen, and those animals are going to be, if you think about spending more of their zinc just to sustain an immune response. And perhaps if they were kind of right on the line of having enough zinc for optimal growth and they get a disease challenge, then that may pull down their available zinc and use that up so that they don't have that for additional growth. I guess that's
Right.
the way I kind of conceptually think about it.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, that's where my question really comes
Yeah.
in. I've done studies at universities. It's great. It's all in, all out, and there's a start and a stop. But on a
Mm-hmm.
commercial operation, you're going to have inflows and outflows all the time. So it may be worthwhile to try to do something on a commercial operation where you would have more disease pressure pretty much all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and I think that's important. That's a really important consideration too, and the difference in the small pen research setting compared to a commercial situation. And I think the other thing too is in some of these studies we saw some pretty large responses, high growth rate cattle. And I'm certainly not going to go out there and advertise like, hey, if you feed 3 times the level of zinc sulfate, you're going to get 9 additional pounds of hot carcass weight. That's not going to happen, right? Uh, but if that real response is even, if that's a 1% improvement in hot carcass weight over a couple of years, just by changing your trace mineral program, that's meaningful, and there's a sizable amount of return I think to be had there. And I guess that's the way that I like to translate that to a commercial setting is that that real response, if we could be all knowing, that real response may be very small, but I think it's still very meaningful.
Sure.
Dathan, if you said this early on, I missed it, but were all of these studies done on beef on dairy, or were some of them on straight beef
No,
calves and some
no,
were beef on
sorry, no.
dairy?
So actually, none of these were done on beef on dairy. I simply tried, and this was one of the things when Gail recruited me initially. I was like, well, a lot of this has been done in native beef calves. Um, And she's like, well, that's fine. Just try to connect it to beef on dairy. So the beef on dairy connection really was those calves are much more likely to come in with very high liver copper. And I do think that to the previous question about zinc and immune function, I think just their zinc demand. I don't have any data to back this up, but their disease pressure susceptibility to disease, I would guess, means that they probably have a little bit higher requirement for zinc in a lot of cases, and they would probably still respond to that additional zinc when they're given an implant and or a beta agonist. So sorry if I didn't clarify that well enough early on.
Any other questions? I've got one that'll just be kind of being an antagonist myself, which I'm usually really good at. Will the Gospel of Mason change to identify your findings? Will there be a column that says, if you're using this technology, then do this? Because our nutritionists, follow this pretty closely.
Mhm.
What say you?
I think that do I think we have a big enough, robust enough data set to really do that? Maybe. I know the dairy NASM went to a factorial approach and modeling. I don't know that we have the ability to do that necessarily in the beef world. Do I think we should? Yeah. I'm not going to write that chapter. I've tried to talk my old boss into that and to Steph into writing that chapter, and I don't know that she's game for it. But I think that's a worthwhile consideration. I'll say that.
Okay, any other questions? I'll give a second or two, just unmute your mic. Well, at this point, thank you, Dathan, for sharing this information and your insights and strategies concerning mineral strategies. This program has been recorded and will be available on the I-29 Moo University website, located at i-29moo.com, Beef on Dairy Dialogue. Give me 3 to 5 working days. In addition, I will email you when it's available, as well as including the link to the program evaluation in case you didn't click on it during the program. I thank you for your participation, and I look forward to seeing you all at the next webinar in September. Again, thank you, Dathan.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
At this point, I will end the program.